Started my first startup in '97. The world told me I was insane.
Our goal is creating future economies that are more regenerative and sustainable.
Something didn't match up. Why hasn't this become the next big thing? And that's where we invested.
The whole purpose of achieving anything in life is measurement.
Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Craig Backman, the Chief Operating Officer at ThoughtWire. 2020 has brought historic change and created a massive shutdown on buildings. And as we regain our footing inside buildings, new construction and modernization projects are expected to resume and gain momentum. Buildings of the future need to be sustainable, resilient, hyper-efficient, and people-centric. Learn how to achieve this vision with emerging technologies driving new building trends, global net zero. It's my great pleasure to introduce Craig, and Craig, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks for the intro, Ian. Really appreciate it. We are delighted to be here today to discuss a topic that is close to all of our hearts. Let's be honest, though. Smart buildings and cities are still a vision for the future of how the world can be better. I'm not trying to disparage any of the work that has happened to date. We have collectively made real progress, and our current pace of technology advancement is just breathtaking. But based on our progress through the growth stages of smart buildings, we'd argue that we're still at the toddler phase of the journey, and that what we still have in front of us is a lot of growth to get where we ultimately want to be. When we consider the percentage of new builds that are truly smart, it's relatively small when we look at the entire new built stock. What about the existing stock of buildings? There's clearly a lot of room for improvement. We all know that buildings and how we use them can have an enormous societal effect, from their impact on the environment, with built spaces responsible for up to 38% of greenhouse gas emissions around the globe, to their impact on people's productivity and effectiveness, to their impact on people's safety and well-being, which has been underlined even more during this global pandemic as we consider safe return to work, to their impact on resiliency, or how fast a building can return to normal following any disturbance. We recently took an opportunity to step back and look at the current situation. We asked, what's missing in the recipe? Why haven't we seen more traction for smart buildings? As you can imagine, we came up with a relatively long list, but one thing jumped out. The result of this exploration was an important insight about what's holding us back as an industry, all of us, and in a major way. Let me use an analogy to describe the problem and bring it to life. I'm going to use the Apple iPhone. What you see on the page in front of you right now are all the component parts of an iPhone: a battery, the chips, speakers, charging ports, an aluminum case, glass cover, etc. By themselves, I think you'd agree that they offer limited utility. If someone handed you a bag of these parts, you'd likely pitch them in the recycle bin. However, something happens when these parts are assembled into the iPhone. Now you have something that is much higher value and higher utility. If someone handed you one of these, you would likely be very excited, but it would still be missing something critically important. The final ingredient, something you cannot see, but the thing that makes it all work, the operating system. In Apple's case, it's called iOS. We take iOS for granted, but it's what makes the iPhone greater than the sum of its parts, and why people are willing to spend over $1,000 for a smartphone. It's also what differentiates Apple from its competitors and allows them to be one of the world's most profitable companies. Let's think about what the operating system is and what it does. The operating system is what brings everything together. It connects everything and allows everything to communicate. It offers a layer of control over all the various parts. It allows apps to access all the various technologies that we see in the disassembled phone. More importantly, it brings intelligence where there was none. It takes something that was smart and makes it high IQ. The result is the incredible experience that we enjoy every day, one that makes our lives better. At this point, you're You're probably asking what this has got to do with smart buildings. Let me bring that back into focus. If we go back to our analogy, we believe that built spaces today have only evolved to the assembled stage in the journey. Even so-called smart buildings have not progressed beyond the assembled phase. Let me unpack that. When we look at a building, even brand new ones, they are a collection of largely unconnected technology and systems. Each of the systems might be exceptional on their own, and many are incredibly impressive, but they operate separately, not as part of a whole. A BMS, or building management system, is definitely a step in the right direction, but that only still gets you part of the way. What's missing? If we go back to our analogy, it's the operating system. Built spaces currently lack operating systems, something that can connect and intelligently orchestrate all the technology to achieve a higher level of performance, to deliver better outcomes, and to deliver amazing end user experiences. We believe that's what will take built spaces from smart to high IQ, the addition of an operating system. Imagine a built space with an operating system. What if all the technology systems, people, and external environment are connected and they could communicate using the same language, not just in one direction, but bidirectionally? What if the operating system was continuously watching and looking for insights on how to do things better, providing a level of intelligent orchestration of key activities? What if it could provide a connected experience that made users safer, more productive, happier, and more loyal? What if it could find correlations between things that were never connected previously and recommend better actions to deliver better results? What if it could focus attention on the most important issues while automating simple tasks? What if it could help maximize KPIs across the entire ESG spectrum, environment, social, and governance? Well, all those things are entirely possible with a built space operating system. The impact of adding an operating system could be truly profound. We believe this represents the next stage in the evolution of built spaces, from smart to high IQ. Finally, we don't believe this stops at the individual building level. An operating system can connect and integrate anything. At ThoughtWire, we are on a quest to make that happen. Over the past 12 years, we have innovated an incredible technology platform. We plan to help enable the next stage of the evolution of smart built spaces, and we can proudly claim that we've created one of the world's first and most sophisticated operating systems for built spaces. ThoughtWire OS, an operating system for high IQ smart built spaces. Thank you. Now, Ian, I think we'll move to the panel and the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Craig. If anybody does have any questions for Craig, you can go ahead and ask those to us now. How does ThoughtWire fit with existing BMS systems?
So great question. So I think any operating system should be technology agnostic, and it should be built on the existing technology that's already in a building. ThoughtWire OS does exactly that. The BMS plays an incredibly important role within any built space, but it can only collect so much data. And by adding it into an operating system like ThoughtWire, we get all the benefits of the BMS, plus the ability to connect other data from people, from the external environment, from other systems within the building, which may not go into the BMS yet. So we see the BMS as a critical part of the technology that sits in any built space, and it would integrate into an operating system to give you a higher level of control and intelligent orchestration.
Thanks for that. We've got another question from Greg Sauter. He's another one of our speakers, actually. He's president at WGI. Very compelling. How do you bring along the various stakeholders to participate in the broader vision?
So I think that's an excellent question as well, and we're working through that with a few pilot districts that we're in right now. We believe that this needs to start at the planning phase, where you plan for an operating system in the design and then build of a building or a district. Doing that correctly with the right systems integrator can give you the architecture that's necessary and allow for you to take full advantage of having an operating system in a building or a district.
Great, thanks for that. It looks like we've got Charles Buscarino. Early morning. He is the founder and CIO of Clarient Group, and he's going to be joining us in as well, and we can have a little bit of a panel discussion. Welcome, Charles.
Hello. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, so I just introduced you. We just finished our keynote presentation, and now we're taking questions from the audience. I've got another question that just came in. Do you have your own IoT hardware, or do you interoperate with others? And then Craig and Charles, you guys can feel free to continue the conversation, answer this question in parts, and then if you'd like to just continue the conversation for the next half hour, you can do that as well.
Okay.
Sure.
So let me answer that question. We do not bring our own hardware to the table. We integrate in with existing hardware. We are a software platform, and I think most operating systems would need to come in as this is an operating system that's software. So we would need to connect into IoT devices and all the other systems, technologies, and whatnot available in a system.
Yeah, we've done work with ThoughtWire before, and have found that there's a number of systems that they can integrate with. We've also, used them for edge devices as well, for on-site resiliency as well as improved user experience. So, but we found them to be agnostic.
And Charles, there was a good question that came before you joined, and I thought it might be a good idea to go back to that. And it was really about, where in the process do you consider an operating system, and what's the best route to get this into the planning and development phases of a build?
That's a key question. So I can't emphasize enough. It's as early as possible. The beauty about what we're seeing in smart buildings and these operating systems is most of the systems that we need for an effective outcome are already in the project, right? So what's missing is the planning piece, the ability to get in front of it, align all the disciplines that we're looking to integrate. So the short answer is as soon as possible. Now that said, it's never too late, okay, to get engaged. It just makes it more difficult, and the effectiveness of that. So for example, after bid, where trades have already been awarded, and you're asking them to align, it's difficult. We find the biggest problem when these are issued as performance specs. Okay, it really wants to be baked into the design as early as possible.
And just to let everyone know, we just had Chris Roberts join us, Building Segment Solution Architect and Solution Director at Schneider Electric. We're very excited to have Chris join the panel as well. So thanks so much for joining in, Chris.
Thanks, Ian. Hi, everyone.
And Chris, we got a question before you joined, which I really think I'd like to throw back to you as well. So there was a question about how a building management system and an operating system would work. Is it something that works together? Does one do part of the other's jobs? I think if you could, you come from a company, Schneider Electric, that makes a building management system, and then you install them in a lot of places. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think the industry has a lot of thoughts around this about whether they're complementary, whether they're competing, and ultimately the way we see it and the way we've worked with these in places like healthcare is that they're very complementary in terms of the functionality and the output that they're going to deliver. So building management systems, are very core centered around how that infrastructure of your building works. Focusing on sustainability, it's focusing on resiliency, efficiency around processes. But once you start to connect it to an operating system, you get a lot more variables and a lot more ways in which you can understand how that building performs. And a good example of that is in healthcare, where you think about how you control your building automation system. It's typically on time clocks, it's closed loop control around temperature, pressure control. But now if you start to bring in the context of a clinical pathway or what's happening in terms of the clinical flow, and take, COVID as a great example. If you bring in an infectious patient, the building management system doesn't know that. And this is where the value of connecting into an operating system like ThoughtWire gives a lot more context to how your building automation system should control the environment. So it's fit for purpose. They're both going to provide functionality, and they're very complementary in terms of how they share information, so that they can ultimately achieve the same common goals that the building is trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think if I can add on to what Chris was saying, we're finding a lot in many of the projects that we're doing, we're finding this really focus on user engagement, associate engagement. So when you start looking at items like food services, parking, storage and delivery, and so on, those are the types of items that we see work well to a building operating system, complemented by a BMS that handles all the energy management and efficiency and so on. But we are seeing those use cases that require something a little bit more.
Yeah, just to add on to that as well with Charles, I mean, it's people, places, and processes. When you think about it, and that's where an operating system really brings in a lot more data and variables. Building management system, it's very much centered around how we operate, the building services inside of facilities, particularly in healthcare. So then how do we get those more variables, get better understanding of the context of the building? And I think it's a great way in which these two complement each other.
Thank you. So Ian, if there are no other questions from the floor.
It looks like we do have another question that's just come in from David Wiltz. How are you utilizing Division 25 and other specification sections?
So I'll take that. So that's really the secret sauce, right? So when we're doing these smart buildings and we're trying to integrate into a building operating system, it takes a village, right? So between the HR and the facilities and security and IT and so on, but also it takes a village when it comes to the project teams and the ability to align them in a scope and clear direction. And that's why I was emphasizing before, the earlier you start, it's critical. Division 25 is the language in which all of these groups communicate. All right, so by creating an expectation and an alignment using Division 25, really what ends up happening is we don't necessarily have to educate all the trades on what we're trying to do and the secret sauce around a smart building. We just communicate to them what we expect from every one of their trades and let them do what they do best. But Division 25 is that higher level piece that ties everything together. So it's a critical piece in the traditional smart building development or construction development that we leverage.
Great. Anybody else have thoughts on that one?
I guess just on Charles' point, I mean, it's not just Division 25, but as Charlie mentioned, that the sooner that you get engaged, the sooner that you can coordinate the other packages. Because traditionally, when we think of buildings and how they've been procured, you might get technology has kind of hidden under, Division 23 for the HVAC spec, as an example. So making sure that we have that common agreement of the outcomes and the use cases that we want to achieve, and making sure it's applied and specified in these packages and coordinated is really key. And 25 knits all those together. So it is a key piece in terms of having that kind of common output specification, but you need to coordinate that with the rest of the packages also.
Chris made a point that I'd like to really emphasize. I think the difference between, a really successful smart building and say other types of projects is truly the emphasis on the outcomes at the very beginning. The laying of the groundwork, the definition of the use cases, et cetera. I think there's a tendency in the market to focus on the technology, right? And the technology is fleeting. Even in the timeline of which we produce projects, it leapfrogs itself. But when you focus on the outcomes, okay, and what will make the project successful, then you go and select the technology that will deliver those outcomes. And considering this market is not necessarily mature, there's often more than one. So even wayfinding can use beacons and Wi-Fi and cameras and so on for our occupancy sensing. But knowing that I want occupancy sensing, the nature of it helps me align the technologies. But that use case focus, I think, is key to the success of any one of these projects, and doing that early.
And Chris, I had a question for you. In my in my address, I mentioned that we've got an issue and that we need to take new builds to a better place. But we also have all these existing buildings that are in the market right now. How do you achieve the similar type of smart results from an existing building?
Yeah, I mean, it's always easier with a clean piece of paper to look at how you want to define these outcomes. And I think when we get into existing buildings, there's data which is locked away in siloed and disparate systems, and it's a case of really understanding what data is available, what you're trying to achieve as an outcome, and then looking at things like modernization and looking at how you can upgrade slowly that building so that you can unlock some of the data that's hidden away. So a lot of the time you will have building automation systems, you're going to have energy management systems, and they're all going to have relevant data that's going to be useful for how you want to operate your building. And it's a way of auditing those systems and seeing what's available, what needs to be modernized, what needs to be upgraded, and then just having kind of a logical program in terms of your roadmap for getting you to that end state where you have your outcome-driven value.
To add on to what Chris is saying, we have found this building operating system as being really the opportunity to address these older buildings. So when you take a look at it, and I think we've spoken with developers, they're like, I have a number of properties, they all have different systems, and I think there's a perception that they actually have to replace or upgrade all those systems. And the way we look at it, that's not necessarily the case. When we understand the outcomes, and as Chris was saying, the data that we want to get or the actions that we want to drive, all we really need to do then is look at the systems we have and find out whether or not they're open enough that we can integrate with them. By putting in a building, or a property operating system or an enterprise operating system that normalizes that, frankly, we don't care what systems are out there, so long as we can aggregate the data and communicate with them. And then what ends up happening is you can profile them to say, look, most compatible to least compatible, and that helps provide guidance on, if you are in an upgrade program, how to approach it to raise the bar across the board. So we've been looking at these systems as an opportunity to address those older properties.
Thanks, Charlie. Now another question for you. Who should own the smart building process when you think about approaching one of these projects?
Well, I think the most important thing is that there is an owner, right? And so, like I mentioned before, when we do these projects, it does take a village, right? Because it's not only the building efficiency and operation side where facilities and operations be focused, but it is this, on the more forward-thinking ones, it's this user engagement, which does involve HR and IT and so on. So what we found is on the very successful one, there's actually been a group of people, but there is an owner. And I think there's an owner from the client side who is the keeper of the flame, because it does take work. And then there needs to be an owner in the project team. And that is typically not the architect or the engineer or the GC in a hope that everybody will play nice, but it has to have a designated owner. We often play that role. There are others who can do that as well. But there's this momentum that needs to be kept all the way through the project, and someone who's making sure that it's all coming together as it should. So specialty consultants are usually the best play for that.
Thank you. Another question for you, Chris. And we hear this question a lot. Operating systems are complicated. Once they've been installed, what happens if they stop working? Who's going to help someone out?
Well, I think that's always the question that operators of these systems will have. I mean, traditionally, when you looked at just a building automation system or BMS, the first point of finger pointing was the BMS group. So the system's not working. How do you go and fault find it? So making sure that you do have the right SOPs or standard operating procedures in place, you have the right service level agreements to make sure that you do have resolution and be able to identify where these faults are occurring from is very important, because when you move into more of kind of that software level architecture, that there's going to be APIs and there's going to be changes in these requests of data transfer. So you need to have the right level of process in place to identify it. Now, is that a function of your traditional facility team, or does it move into your IT department? I think this is where we're seeing that discussion kind of get converged over who actually owns that operating system, and who owns the building automation system, and who owns all the other systems inside that building, and making sure that you do have the right SLAs and SOPs in place to be able to respond if you do have an issue. But I think that the most important thing when you're thinking of an overlay system like an operating system is that if it stops functioning, it doesn't inhibit the subsystems to work. I mean, that's core to a building. When we think about resiliency of a healthcare building, we need to make sure that the systems operate individually, and it's all about how they can transfer data and consume data to have that advanced level of operation.
I think that's key. The other thing I'd add to what Chris is saying, and we've spent a lot of time on this, is normalizing the SLAs, right? So you can't have one application that's critical that has a 2-hour response time and hold everybody else to a 20-minute, 30-minute response time. So there's some effort up front that has to, across those critical applications to make sure they're all aligned.
Thank you. And then, Charlie, a question for you. How is the development of a smart building different than a traditional building?
Well, I think, it goes back to some of the things that I pointed out before. I think a traditional building tends to look at technology, in silos, whereas a smart building is really looking at that integration. It's the starting of the use cases to ensure the outcomes are understood. It's the project approach and this team village approach. But I also think that there is this element of vision, okay, that I think is, when you start a smart building, it really is a reimagining of what is possible, as opposed to just the traditional, we're going to build a building that's make sure it's energy efficient and can hold occupants. And this view of reimagining of what the outcomes are. So that visioning piece, I think, sets the framework. The other thing I'd say is that when you identify what those key outcomes are, generally they're foundational and transformative, and it creates a stickiness that creates a momentum that carries through the entire project. So it just has a different feel than what I would say in the traditional projects, where we have a lot of siloed capabilities versus the smart building.
Thank you. Another question, and I wanted to think a little bit beyond an individual building and look more at kind of the districts and cities. And I think both of you are starting to have some experience with this. How does the game change when you start thinking about multiple buildings, multi-use buildings, either in kind of a city or district space or in the healthcare space? Chris, I know that there's consideration happening around the world about, in essence, healthcare cities. So how does the game change when you're thinking about a much larger built space and the interconnectedness of all of that?
Yeah, I mean, if you just take healthcare as an example, I mean, you talk about patient experiences, and it's not just the experience in the hospital or the outpatient facility, it's the experience of actually getting from your home to the hospital, to that end area. So this is where you start to get that connectivity. How does getting from your home to a hospital, impact patient delays, late appointments? And this is where we start to see connectivity of things like, Uber coming into healthcare to make sure that they can get people to their appointments on time. It's connecting into transport systems to see where there might be delays on train services, etc. And all of this becomes relevant because when you're thinking about how you want to do patient experience and improve patient outcomes, it's about how you make sure that end-to-end continuum for the patient is really monitored and managed. And that's everything from the home to the transport getting to the facility and then connected. So that's where you start to see all this data set coming in. The building's going to operate, it's going to have an output to its community, but it's also needs to know what's happening with its context of its environment to get people into that building and how it needs to kind of respond and be resilient to those changing needs.
Yeah, I think that, I think Chris hit it. That continuation of experience that makes it seem ubiquitous, where the barriers between building and outside and next building and so on are seamless. We've been looking at projects where, CBRS, or we're engaged in projects where CBRS is, a solution that's being considered to create these private networks to allow that continuity. But it also creates opportunities for tenants who now don't necessarily have barriers in one building. If they're in multiple buildings, that continuous experience of a common network as they move throughout, or food ordering, or activities and events and so on. It is a game changer. But I think what also happens is the community that has to be engaged has expanded. So now you have to engage municipalities, you have to engage the outdoor carriers and so on, and how to create those experiences. So I think it's an extension of what we do in the building. There's more layers of activity that has to take place and be planned. All right, that infrastructure needs to be in place, or you need to understand what the limitations are, and how to make sure that it can live up to the capabilities that you're anticipating.
Okay, and then one question I wanted to tackle is, we often get asked the question around, what about privacy? People are very concerned about sharing their location, about having their data, go places where that they don't want it to go. Certainly, it was data privacy that shut down the Sidewalk Labs district in Toronto recently. And I think we've done a lot of exploration on that and have become a founding member of a group called Innovate Cities. And what Innovate Cities is all about is looking at a concept called a data trust. I think they've advanced this really far now. This concept of the data trust would allow us to moderate the data in a way which is private, secure, and safe for anyone who comes into a connected experience in a district or city. And I think that that's incredibly important. Having seen a large player like Google fail in their first entry into a smart district because of privacy, is a warning signal to all of us that this is something that's really important. And I think the data trust concept is one that can go a long way to helping the connected experience that we're looking for in a connected smart city a reality. Okay, Chris, question for you. How do we avoid value engineering during the process of getting to a smart building or district?
Well, I think this is, Charlie hit on this earlier. It's about, the earlier that you get engaged and the earlier that you come to your common objectives and what outcomes you want to achieve. Value engineering typically happens, through the traditional procurement process, where we start looking at, cost reduction, or, we haven't budgeted for certain types of functionality. But we can avoid that by making sure we do cost certainty earlier in the design stage. And that's where your smart building design should be started, because you're going to get agreement and prioritization and agreement around cost, and get input into those cost models and cost plans earlier, so that you can eliminate the need to have to strip out functionality because you might have project overrun, or you might have budget constraints later in that project. So it is all about making sure that you kind of move up the chain around where you want to do a lot of the technology decisions, and make sure that everyone's on that common agreement. Could be procurement models, whether it's things like IPD, integrated project delivery, design assists, just making sure that everyone does have that kind of common objective, and making sure that decisions are made that are going to be beneficial to the output of the building and not necessarily beneficial to the output of the different parties who are delivering the solutions.
Thank you. And Charlie, another question for you. You bring a lot of experience to the smart building space. Could you just maybe take a couple of seconds and share with the audience the role that the Clarient Group would play in a smart building project?
Sure. The smart building evolution I think it's, for most people, it's confusing. There's, almost infinite number of options and choices, and where do I start, and who needs to be included, and how do I navigate? So what TCG, the Clarient Group, does is we actually start at the very beginning with the ideation, and help now, walk our clients through what the use cases are that are appropriate for their property, and help navigate that conversation. We bring hundreds of use cases for consideration in this day in the life journey, from before you leave to after you arrive to after you depart. and to help almost put themselves in the property on what that vision is. At that point, it's a matter of identifying, well, what is the technology that I need in order to enable these use cases? And to the point where we're talking about, value engineering, there's a tendency to over-design unnecessarily because they don't know what the use cases are, and so therefore we need to, get the greatest, and when we put in thousands of points and make sure that we're flexible for whatever, that may not be necessary. And if you are going to VE, you know what you're giving up. It's not a question. But then taking them all the way through to the Division 25 and procuring vendors and so on, all the way through to execution and then beyond. It's after you've completed the project, it wants to be an iterative process of perpetual improvement. So helping our clients deal with that as well and managing and owning this complete life cycle.
Thank you. And Chris, I'm going to give you the same opportunity. You're with Schneider Electric, one of the platinum sponsors of this event. Why don't you give us a little bit of the background on Schneider, the value that you bring to the built space world and smart buildings?
Yeah, I mean, so for us, I mean, we really focus on what we call buildings of the future, and when we're looking at smart buildings in the context of Schneider, it's really looking at how we can look at sustainable buildings, sustainable through the design process, through the products that we use, and then how we operate that facility. Looking at things like renewables. Utilizing microgrids to be more sustainable in terms of how that building is designed and operated. It's really focusing on resiliency of how we design and operate the building, making sure that we provide in healthcare, for example, the maximum uptime so that the core services of healthcare can be delivered. But it's also about flexibility. We know that there's going to be changing function inside of these spaces. So how do we build a facility that's resilient, adaptable, and flexible for the future? And then, of course, it's about hyper efficiency. And this is where our systems and our end-to-end platform is really looking at how we can help be more predictive and move to more condition-based maintenance regimes where we can get better understanding from the data from the infrastructure so that we can make better decisions around how we deliver maintenance in the facility. And then lastly, because, we all spend a lot of time in these buildings, it's about the occupant experience. It's about the environment which we're staying in, which is going to help us be more productive, more comfortable. So it's about making sure that environment is really controlled and appropriate for the people in that space. So that's really how we focus on it. It's about bringing our EcoStruxure platform together, through our core domains of expertise in building, in power, in IT, and in grid, and then really combining them so that we can provide supervisory and control, as well as apps and analytics that are going to help drive better decision making around how we operate and how we make decisions around future of the building.
Okay, thank you.
It looks like we did have one additional question, actually a couple of additional questions. We've got 2 minutes, so let's see if we can get at least one of these in. Where do you see the role of traditional MEP engineers and MEP contractors in smart buildings?
Charlie, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So I don't think their role has changed in where they are in traditional. I think it carries forward, but I think the opportunity to support the process. So for example, one of the key things when doing a smart building is the ability to normalize data. All right. So, building that into their specs, saying, listen, if we're going to talk about power, we're going to talk about watts. We're not going to talk about kVA. We're not going to talk about volt amps. We're not going to talk about kW. We're going to talk about watts. Those types of things set the table for this integration and streamline the process. I think that they're extremely important as part of the delivery of a smart building, and there's definitely value in how they can understand the agenda and help move it forward. They're a critical piece to the whole thing.
Awesome. Thanks for the panel, everybody. This was really insightful, and we had some great questions come in. Again, this was all recorded, so we'll be sure to send this out after the event is complete. But again, I want to thank all of our panelists, and then just let our attendees know that next we have 3 concurrent sessions that are coming up, and you'll be able to find those in the reception or the sessions tab to the left of your screen. Continue to ask great questions and engage with the panelists, and you'll be seeing each of these speakers in other sessions, so there'll be some great opportunities for networking. But with that, thank you again, and we will see you guys for the rest of the day at Summit.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Pleasure.
Take care.